They called me into the office on the last shift before New Year's Eve, when the factory floor was still buzzing, but the air already had that heavy quiet of a holiday coming. I'd been expecting a routine end-of-year briefing, maybe a handshake, maybe even a small thank you for the decades I'd spent keeping those machines alive. Instead, the new supervisor, a man with spotless hands and a wristwatch that cost more than my first car, didn't even offer me a chair. He just pulled an envelope from a neat stack on his desk, slid it toward me, and said without so much as blinking, "You're not part of the future here." That was it. No, thank you for your service. No, it's nothing personal. Just a clean cut with a dull knife, words rehearsed so many times they didn't sound like words anymore. More like a factory instruction read off a card. I took the envelope without looking at it, the way you might pick up a stranger's lost glove. My fingers curled around it, and I nodded as if to say I understood, even though I didn't. Not really. I turned and walked out, each step on the office carpet muffled, each one heavier than the last. When the door to the factory yard swung open, a gust of winter air hit me like a wall. The smell of the place, the old mixture of hot oil, iron filings, and the faint tang of burned solder, rolled over me. I'd breathed that smell for most of my life. It had clung to my skin, my clothes, my hair. It was a smell that said home more than my own kitchen did. But today, it was different. It didn't welcome me. It pressed against me, like the breath of a stranger standing too close. I crossed the gravel lot toward the gate, my boots crunching against frost. The sound was sharp, brittle, almost like breaking glass. Beyond the fence, I could still hear the low hum of the machines, the presses, the cutters, the conveyors, all of them talking to each other in that steady rhythm I'd learned to understand like a second language. I had spent years listening to their moods, their complaints, their quiet sighs before a jam. I had coaxed them through midnight breakdowns with nothing but a wrench, a flashlight, and stubbornness. And now they spoke to someone else. The gate clanged shut behind me, with a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. My job wasn't the only thing ending that day. I'd been cut off from the pulse that had kept me alive, from the language my hands had spoken for decades. I had been dismissed not just from a payroll, but from a place in the world where I mattered. No one followed me. No one tried to soften the blow. And maybe that was the part that stung the deepest. The quiet assumption that I would take the envelope, vanish into the cold, and dissolve into memory like a face in an old photograph. But as I walked away, the frost biting through my gloves and the sky sagging low with the weight of snow, I felt something settle inside me. Not bitterness, not yet, but a kind of heavy clarity. They might believe they'd erased me from the factory's story. They might think I was just a line item deleted without consequence. But I knew something they didn't. Can't erase the hands that taught the steel how to breathe. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever gone through something like this in your life? If you feel connected to this story, I'd be truly grateful if you could subscribe and share this video. It's the best way to help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. All right, let's continue. At home, I wound the old alarm clock the way I always had, the metal key turning with that familiar little resistance. I set it for the same time I'd been waking up for years, out of habit more than necessity. When it rang the next morning, its sharp, tinny bell felt strangely out of place, like a voice calling for someone who no longer lived there. I sat up, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and for a moment my body moved on instinct. My hands reached for work clothes, my feet found the boots by the door, and I even caught myself checking for my ID badge, the one that used to hang from my belt. It wasn't there. I remembered why. The walk to the kitchen felt heavier than any walk I'd taken down the factory hallways. The radio was still tuned to the station we used to keep on low in the break room, the one with the steady hum of old songs and hourly news about nothing that mattered. I poured coffee and listened to the silence between the notes, realizing how used I'd been to the undercurrent of machinery, the presses breathing in slow, steady cycles, the belts whispering against steel rollers, the faint clinks of bolts and tools that came from nowhere in particular. Without that backdrop, the quiet in my house was almost hostile. I thought about driving over to the plant just to walk past it, to hear something, anything. But what would that make me? A shadow on the sidewalk, peering in through glass at a world that had already moved on. My hands itched for the weight of the tools they had known so well. I could feel the remembered tension of the lever, the exact turn of a valve before a machine shifted from complaint to cooperation. Every part of me carried the blueprint of that place, but the door that once opened at the swipe of my badge was now nothing but a locked slab of metal. The day dragged. I tried reading the paper, but my eyes drifted to the window every time a truck passed, hoping to catch the sound of gears changing, the groan of a heavy load being eased into place. The truth was simple and cruel. My life had been measured not in days or hours, but in the rhythm of those machines, and now the rhythm was gone. Silence was supposed to be peaceful. I'd imagined retirement would come with it someday, in some gentle way. But this was not peace. This was the kind of silence that presses on your chest, that follows you from room to room, that makes you feel like if you speak too loudly, the walls might echo back and remind you how empty they are. By evening, I stopped turning on the radio. The static between stations felt too much like the hollow space between what my life had been and what it had become. I sat in the dark, listening for sounds that weren't there, and understood for the first time how a man can feel lonely in his own home. They had taken the noise of the factory away from me, but in its place, they had left something worse. A silence so deep it made me wonder if I still existed at all. He stood at the front of the room as if it were a stage, sleeves rolled just enough to look effortless, the fabric crisp and untouched by the kind of stains you earn over years. His words floated over the rows of folding chairs. Digital transformation, streamlined workflows, cost efficiency. Phrases that sounded polished and modern, but carried no scent of oil, no weight of steel, no memory of the factory's heartbeat. He talked about machines that could run themselves, about algorithms that could predict malfunctions before they happened. The younger workers nodded like students at a lecture, their faces bright with the promise of something cleaner, faster, newer. I sat there, the weight of my years balanced on the edge of the plastic chair. When he spoke of legacy staff, his eyes passed over me without stopping. He didn't say my name. No one did. I was the veteran, a budget inefficiency, a line in a spreadsheet marked in red. It wasn't just that they wanted me gone. It was that they wanted the memory of me gone. As if the factory's history could be rewritten without the people who had built it with their hands. I could feel the subtle shift in the air. This wasn't about numbers, no matter how they dressed it up. This was about erasing the way things used to be, about replacing the human rhythm of the shop floor with something sterile and obedient. Machines don't argue, don't remember, don't tell stories about the night. A power outage nearly froze the entire line, and only a handful of us kept it alive until dawn. Machines don't look at a young worker and say, "Here, let me show you how it's really done." Machines just work until they don't, and when they don't, there's no one left who knows their language. The new manager's voice was smooth, almost warm, but there was no place in it for the smell of burnt metal or the sound of bolts falling into a calloused palm. I watched his hands as he gestured, pale, unscarred, untouched by the bite of a slipping wrench or the heat of a welding torch. Hands like that could type numbers, point at charts, sign papers that ended decades. But they couldn't feel when a gear was about to fail just by the way the vibration changed under your fingers. I sat through the meeting, surrounded by people who used to call me by name, who once leaned on my knowledge as if it were another tool on the wall. Now their eyes slid past me. Not out of malice, but out of quiet agreement with the tide that was carrying me away. The applause at the end was polite, light, and meant for someone else entirely. Walking out, I didn't feel angry, not yet. Anger requires the belief that you can still change the outcome. What I felt was colder, heavier, the understanding that they weren't just replacing me, They were rewriting the story so I'd never been here at all. And in that moment, I realized the fight ahead wasn't to prove my worth. It was to make sure the memory of what we built couldn't be scrubbed from the walls as easily as my name from the payroll. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the dim light pooling on the notepad in front of me. The pen moved in slow, deliberate strokes, each word chosen like a carefully measured cut. The complaint took shape in neat, even lines, every point backed by dates, by clauses from the contract, by the regulations they themselves had once drilled into us during safety meetings. I wrote about the promises made and broken, about the machinery that needed care they no longer valued, about the quiet way they'd stripped me of my name and replaced it with a number on a balance sheet. By the time I reached the last page, my hand ached, the tendons stiff from holding the pen so tightly. The letter looked complete, ready to be signed, sealed, and sent into a system that would pretend to consider it before burying it under bureaucracy. I stared at it for a long time, imagining the path it would take. The clerk glancing over the first lines, the manager skimming for anything dangerous, the official reply stamped with a date and a hollow assurance that my concerns were noted. I thought about what I really wanted. It wasn't a hearing. It wasn't a signature from someone who'd never smelled hot steel or wiped coolant from their boots. I wanted something no stamp could deliver, the kind of justice that comes quietly, through the hands of someone who understands that machines aren't just metal, they're memory. I wanted the press to hum again under the touch of someone who knew its song, the conveyor to stop stuttering because a trained ear caught the falter in its rhythm. I wanted the factory to remember itself. The paper in front of me was just words, and words once filed could be ignored. But a machine refusing to run without the right hands, that couldn't be ignored. That was truth you could hear, see, feel. Slowly I picked up the pages and folded them once, then again, my fingers pressing sharp creases into the paper. I could feel the weight of every sentence, the way you feel the weight of a part in your palm before fitting it into place. Then I tore the letter in half. The sound was quick, final, almost clean enough to be mistaken for satisfaction. The pieces lay scattered on the table, black ink on white strips, like fragments of something that had never really been whole. I brushed them into the wastebasket and sat back, letting the silence return. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of the past weeks. This one felt different, lighter. Like I'd decided, without speaking it aloud, that I wouldn't beg for justice in the language of forms and signatures. Somewhere, deep in the dark of the night, I imagined the hum of the factory floor. Not as it was now, cold, mechanical, obedient, but as it used to be, alive and imperfect, with a heartbeat you could feel through the soles of your boots. That's where justice lived. Not in paper, but in steel, not in stamps, but in the hands that could listen to a machine breathe. And I knew that one way or another, those hands would find their way back. The night they optimized me out of the roster, the press on line 3 coughed out a crooked run. It was the kind of flaw you couldn't see at first glance. The shape still looked right, the edges still sharp, but if you ran your fingers along it, you'd feel the faint, uneven bow, the tiny resistance where smoothness should have been. That press had always been temperamental, the kind of machine that required more than maintenance schedules and calibration charts. It needed to be guided like a stubborn horse, coaxed into rhythm, and kept there with the right balance of force and patience. The new crew didn't hear it go wrong. They were watching the readouts on their screens, trusting the neat green numbers that told them everything was within tolerance. But tolerance isn't the same as perfection, and numbers can't catch the shift in tone when the press stops breathing evenly. You have to hear it, deep in the base of its frame, that almost imperceptible hesitation between impact and recoil, the sigh of steel that says something's about to drift. By the time anyone noticed, a whole stack had been stamped wrong. They didn't see it as wrong, of course. They saw it as acceptable variance. The customer didn't agree, but instead of admitting the press had been mishandled, they blamed the supplier for a bad batch of raw stock. It was easier that way. Easier than admitting no one on the floor that night had the ears for the job. I wasn't there, but I heard about it from a welder I'd trained years ago. His message was brief, almost embarrassed. A note about some issues on 3 and management not happy. I could picture the scene without being told. The young supervisor frowning at the parts, the techs running diagnostics that told them nothing, the low grumble in the break room as everyone avoided pointing fingers. And all the while, the press sat there, quiet now, its bolts cooling, its rhythm gone. Machines don't lie, not really. They can be stubborn, they can be unpredictable, but they don't pretend. When a machine is wrong, it says so. In its own language. The problem is not everyone knows how to listen. I thought about that crooked batch for days. I imagined the way the first bad hit must have sounded, just slightly off, a fraction slower on the rebound, like a tired breath. I had always kept an ear out for those moments, stepping in before the damage spread. That's the difference between watching a gauge and hearing a machine. A gauge will tell you when you're already in trouble. A machine will warn you before you get there, if you know how to listen. They didn't hear it. And in not hearing it, they'd proved something I'd been telling myself since the day I walked out. That no matter how modern they made the place, no matter how many touch screens and automated checks they installed, the factory still needed hands and ears like mine. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because certain kinds of knowledge can't be programmed. Somewhere in that quiet truth was the first crack in their new world. Not big enough yet to break it apart, but deep enough to make the steel remember the sound of the man who once kept it breathing. I began walking to the factory gates in the mornings, not because I had a reason to be there, but because my feet seemed to know no other route. The first time, I told myself it was just to pass by, to see the smoke rising from the stacks and feel, for a moment, that the old rhythm of my days still existed somewhere. I stopped across the street, leaning on the fence post, watching the workers file in with their lunch pails and their cigarettes, shoulders hunched against the wind. A few noticed me, gave a small wave or a nod. 1 or 2 smiled, a quiet, knowing kind of smile. Soon it became a habit. I was no longer part of their shift, but I was part of their morning. They'd greet me with short phrases, the kind that don't need answers. Hang in there, Uncle Pasha. Cold one today? Sometimes a young worker would jog over, slipping me a thermos of hot tea before rushing back in, as if afraid someone might see. I never lingered too close to the gate. It wasn't my place anymore to step inside, but it was still my place to watch. After a while, the boys from the technical school started showing up earlier, hoping to catch me before the siren sounded. They carried tool belts that looked too new, and gloves that hadn't yet learned the shape of their fingers. They asked about torque and thread sizes, about why a bolt sometimes loosens even when you've tightened it as hard as you can. I'd take a nut and bolt from one of their pouches and show them, not with force, but with rhythm. The turn, the pause, the small, settling twist at the end that locks it in place. It was like teaching them a song in a language they didn't know they could speak. They listened the way young men listen when they sense they're being told something that won't be in any manual. I told them rhythm was the thing you can't buy with a tender or find in a bidding contract. It's the part of the work that lives in your body, that grows in your bones until you can hear it, even in your sleep. A machine will forgive you a lot if you respect its rhythm. Disrespect it, and it will eat through your best parts before the week is out. Standing there in the cold, watching their faces light up when they got it right, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I left. Usefulness. Not the kind that shows up on a payroll, but the kind that leaves its mark on someone's hands, that carries forward long after you've stepped away. Each morning I'd leave before the foreman made his rounds, disappearing into the side streets as the first shift roared to life. But even from a distance, I could hear it, the faint echo of my own rhythm threading itself back into the heart of the place, bolt by bolt, turn by turn. The defect section began to swell like a bruise no one wanted to press. At first it was just one pallet pushed to the side, an odd run, maybe a minor misalignment, tagged with a neat slip of paper that read, "Review." A week later, there were 3 pallets, then 5. By the end of the month, the overflow space, a place meant for occasional surplus, was a narrow, winding path between stacks of rejects. The parts sat there in silence, waiting to be scrapped or reworked, their fresh edges still smelling faintly of oil and heat. But if you looked closely, you could see it. A faint warping, an angle just a hair too sharp, a groove that didn't quite catch the light right. Every rejected part was a sentence in the same story, the kind you don't write down because you already know the ending. They were the proof that something inside the heart of the factory was slipping out of sync. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a machine drifts when no one listens closely enough to its breathing. The word emergency, once a thing shouted over the roar of machinery, when a belt jammed or a bearing blew, now showed up in quiet text messages and muted company chat threads. No exclamation marks, just the lowercase weight of resignation. Averill in Section 2, Line 3, falling behind. Even those messages slowed down over time, not because the emergency stopped, but because there were too many to name. Management tried to keep their tone even. The new supervisor would walk the floor in his perfect shoes, speaking about adaptation periods and short-term setbacks. He'd stand near the growing wall of defective parts and wave a hand at it like it was a temporary inconvenience. "We'll get through this," he'd say, as if the sight of hours of wasted labor and thousands in material losses was something you could talk into disappearing. But the floor told a different story. Conversation shrank. Eye contact carried more weight than words. A simple glance across the aisle between two workers could say everything. You hear that sound? You feel that vibration? They don't know what's wrong. But we do. Only no one dared to speak it aloud. Not in front of management. Not in a room where anyone might be listening. Instead, it became a whisper passed in the break room, in the hallway to the lockers, by the loading dock, when the night air felt safer than the walls inside. We need the one who could hear the machine breathe. The fatigue spread like dust, settling on every surface, seeping into every shift. Shoulders slumped earlier in the day, breaks stretched longer, cigarettes burning down to filters in silence. The coffee pot sat half full long after the buzzer, the steam curling upward like it knew there was no urgency left to feed. It wasn't just tired bodies, it was tired spirits. Working next to a machine you can't trust drains you in ways no overtime pay can repair. From beyond the gates, I could hear the change without needing to see it. The factory had always had a kind of music. The deep, steady thud of presses, the rolling murmur of conveyors, the quick staccato of tools striking in practiced rhythm. Now it was a fractured, uneven noise like a band playing without a conductor. There were pauses where there shouldn't be any, harsh metallic clangs where once there had been smooth transitions, and underneath it all a low tension you could almost taste in the air. The sound of people fighting to keep the line alive, without the one thing they'd been taught to believe they didn't need anymore. Inside, the defect section kept growing, and no one said the truth where the new manager could hear it. But I could hear it, carried in the shuffle of boots across the floor, in the way the shift siren didn't quite match the energy of the people answering it. They could pretend in reports and presentations that the system was still working. But the growing wall of flawed steel behind those gates said otherwise, and steel, unlike men, doesn't know how to lie. They called it a planning meeting, but it felt more like a performance. The long table in the conference room was lined with papers no one would actually read, and charts printed in colors meant to look optimistic. The new manager stood at the head, speaking about alignment of goals and embracing change, his voice smooth and steady, as if nothing outside these four walls was falling apart. I sat in the back, not because I had to be there. I no longer did, but because an old friend from the floor had told me I should come, that it might be worth hearing. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, but there was an emptiness to the room, the kind that comes when everyone's just waiting to be told what's already been decided. And then he spoke, my old partner, the man I'd worked beside for nearly 20 years. We'd shared night shifts that blurred into morning, split sandwiches when one of us forgot to bring lunch, passed tools wordlessly because we knew each other's habits as well as we knew the machines. We'd been a team in the truest sense, not bound by titles, but by the kind of trust that comes from sweating through the same problems in the same airless room. He cleared his throat and said almost casually, The time for the old guys is over. No name, no direct reference, but every person in that room knew who he meant. His eyes flickered once toward my side of the room and then quickly away, as if looking at me too long might make him falter. The words didn't come like a slap. They came like a slow, cold draft creeping under the door, finding its way into your bones. Betrayal isn't always loud. More often it's a whisper dressed as progress. He talked about fresh approaches, new energy, and letting go of outdated methods. On paper, it was nothing more than the language of transition. In reality, it was the clean, quiet cutting of a rope we'd been tied to for decades. As he spoke, I noticed his hands resting on the table, not calloused the way they used to be, softer now, with the faint shine of a watch that hadn't been there back when we were splitting overtime shifts. I realized then that his world had shifted in ways mine hadn't. He wasn't thinking about the machines or the people who ran them. He was thinking about percentages, of output, of bonuses, of loyalty measured in numbers instead of years. The room stayed still. No one challenged him, not openly. But I caught the slight tightening of jaws, the way some of the older workers stared at the table instead of at him, as though they too felt the weight of what had just been said, but couldn't afford to carry it out loud. When the meeting ended, he didn't come over. He didn't meet my eyes. He left through a side door, moving quickly, the way a man does when he knows he's left something behind and doesn't want to face it. I stayed seated for a long moment after everyone else had gone, staring at the place where he'd stood. We'd once been on the same side of every problem. Now, he had stepped across to a side where the language was cleaner, the rewards quicker, and the debts invisible. Betrayal rarely arrives in a shout. It slips in quietly, wearing the clothes of reason, speaking in the calm, convincing tones of someone who's already decided what matters most to them, and it's no longer you. The first signs didn't come in headlines or memos. They came in the quiet panic of the scheduling board. Deadlines that had always been written in firm, confident ink were now penciled in, erased, and rewritten, the dates creeping forward like they were trying to escape the page. The main contract, the one that had kept the lights on, the machines humming, and the paychecks steady for years, was suddenly uncertain. No one said it outright at first, but everyone could feel it. The lifeline was fraying. On the floor, Line 3 had begun to sing off key again. To most ears, it still sounded like a machine doing its job, heavy and sure, but I knew that song, and this was not the right verse. The cadence was slightly wrong, the rebound sluggish, the impact muted like a drum with a loose skin. It was the kind of flaw that doesn't scream until it's too late, the kind that a good ear can catch in its earliest whisper. Only no one in the room was listening for that kind of music anymore. The new manager called it an expected adjustment period. The consultants called it part of the modernization process. They stood in conference rooms lit too bright, pointing at slides full of green arrows that bent optimistically upward, talking over photographs of polished equipment and smiling workers. But out on the floor, the real rhythm was slipping further out of sync. The press didn't care about presentation slides. The conveyor didn't understand marketing language. And the workers, the ones still trying to keep it all together, had long since stopped believing in the optimism printed on glossy paper. The contract's representatives came for an inspection, walking the floor with their hands clasped behind their backs, their shoes silent against the concrete. They stopped by Line 3, watched it work for a few minutes, and said nothing. But I saw the way they looked at the output, the faint narrowing of eyes, the quiet exchange of glances that needed no words. They could hear it too, maybe not in the way I could, but enough to know that something wasn't right. After they left, the rumors began moving like air through an open vent. Some said the client was already in talks with another supplier. Others claimed they'd agreed to a probation period, that the next few shipments would decide everything. In the break room, no one wanted to be the first to say what we all knew. The factory was suffocating. Not from lack of work, but from too much of the wrong kind. From the constant pressure to dress up numbers instead of fixing what was breaking. I thought about how the place had been built, not just in brick and steel, but in calloused hands, in the long nights when someone stayed late to make sure a shipment went out perfect, in the unspoken pride of watching a truck roll away carrying something you knew was the best you could make. Now it was choking on jargon and meetings, on decisions made far from the floor, on the belief that a problem could be solved if you just explained it well enough on a slide. The truth was simpler, sharper, and far less forgiving. You can't talk a machine into working right. You can only listen, learn its language, and answer before it starts to fail. And no matter how many meetings they held, no matter how many arrows they drew pointing upward, the music of the factory was changing, and not for the better. They called me one morning, their voices polite in a way they hadn't been for months. "Could you stop by just for an hour to take a look?" It was framed as a favor, a small consultation, as if I were some casual acquaintance with a bit of spare time. I could hear the hesitation under the words, the reluctant admission that they needed something they no longer had. They didn't say the word problem, but it was there, hanging between us in the pause before they asked. When I arrived, I didn't bother fishing out my old badge. It was still in a drawer at home, the photo worn and the edges frayed, but here it meant nothing. The turnstile didn't open for me anymore. I stood for a moment, waiting, until the guard glanced up, recognized my face, and waved me through. He didn't check a list. He didn't need to. Some doors you pass because you belong on paper. Others you pass because the people inside know you're already part of the place, even if the system says otherwise. I stepped onto the floor, and it was like walking into a room full of old friends I hadn't seen in years. The smell of oil and hot steel wrapped around me instantly, settling into my clothes as if it had just been waiting for me to return. The machines stood in their familiar rows, some humming low, some resting between cycles. I walked past each one slowly, my hand brushing the edges of frames, my eyes scanning bolts and belts without conscious effort. I could feel them looking back at me in their own way. The faint tremor of a conveyor belt shifting under weight, the gentle rise and fall of a press between strokes, the steady breathing of a lathe as it cooled. Workers glanced up from their stations as I passed. Some gave small nods, some looked away quickly as if not wanting to draw attention to the fact that they were glad I was there. But in their eyes I saw it, the quiet relief of someone who's been treading water too long and has just spotted a lifeboat. No one said, "We need you." They didn't have to. I reached line 3, and before anyone explained, I knew. The sound hit me first, not loud enough to be called broken, but wrong enough to set my teeth on edge. A dullness in the strike, a hesitation in the release, like an old friend whose voice had grown hoarse. I stood beside it, watching the rhythm, feeling the vibrations through the floor and up into my legs. You don't need permission to listen. Someone cleared their throat behind me, ready to start listing the problems they'd been having. I didn't let them. Words wouldn't tell me anything the machine wasn't already saying. I crouched, placed my palm against the housing, and let the metal speak. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just me greeting the machines. They were greeting me back. Every shudder, every hum, every pause was familiar, like a friend leaning in to tell you what's been wrong in your absence. And I knew, without question, that whatever had been lost here in the months since I'd gone could still be found. Not on a chart, not in a meeting, but right here, in the sound of steel, remembering the hands that once kept it breathing. I placed my palm flat against the press, the way a medic rests a hand on a chest to feel the heart beneath. The metal was warm in places it shouldn't be, trembling in ways that spoke of strain, not strength. It didn't matter what the gauges said or what the maintenance logs claimed. The truth was here, pulsing through the steel. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. The cadence was uneven, the recoil too shallow, the stroke lacking the crisp finish that told you the machine was working in harmony with itself. This wasn't a problem of lubrication or misalignment in the obvious sense. It was a deeper kind of sickness, the sort that comes when a machine hasn't been treated like a partner, only a tool. I heard footsteps gather behind me, the faint shuffle of men and women who had been watching, waiting to see if I could find what they couldn't. Some of them had been there the night I was sent away. Others were younger, with eyes wide as if seeing something they'd only heard about in stories, that a machine could be spoken to without words. I didn't turn to face them. My attention stayed on the subtle music under my hand, the faint ticks and sighs the press made as it came down and rose again. "This isn't a grease problem," I said at last, my voice low but certain. "It's an ear problem." A few of them frowned, not yet understanding, but the ones who'd been around long enough nodded, the way you nod when someone finally names what you've been feeling all along. We set to work without ceremony. I asked for a strip of copper plate, not a part you'd find on the official repair list, but one I'd learned to keep close in the old days, for when the press needed a softer touch to guide it back into balance. We slid it into place like a splint under a bone, shifting the vibration just enough to take the strain off the fault line. Then we adjusted the amplitude, pulling it back from the overreach the new settings had been forcing. Finally, I told them to switch the machine into the old warm-up cycle, the one that had been scrapped in the name of efficiency. Machines, like people, can't be rushed to do their best work. It took only a few minutes for the change to show. The first strokes were tentative, like a singer clearing their throat after a long silence. Then the sound deepened, grew steady, and the press began to speak in its old voice again, strong, sure, perfectly in tune with the floor around it. I felt the rhythm through my hand, down my arm, into my chest. This was the sound of work done right, the sound of a machine remembering its purpose. No one clapped. They didn't need to. The proof was in the air, a tension lifting, a note of relief passing quietly from one worker to another. They went back to their stations without being told, their movements sharper now, more confident, as if the press's recovery had reminded them of something they'd nearly forgotten, that the factory could still breathe if someone was willing to listen. I stepped back, wiping my hands on a rag, and caught the eye of a younger mechanic who had been watching every move. His gaze wasn't just curious, it was hungry, the way a man looks at knowledge he wants to claim before it disappears. I gave him a small nod. He'd learned something today that no manual would ever teach. Behind me, the press kept talking, each strike clean and proud, and for the first time in months, the factory answered back. We stayed after the rest of the shift had gone home. The overhead lights dimmed in places where no one was working, the floor quieter except for the heartbeat of the machines that were still running under our hands. The clock on the far wall crept toward midnight, but no one looked at it. Time inside a factory after hours moves differently, slower in some moments, faster in others, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. I gathered them close, the few who had chosen to remain. Some were young enough to still have the shine of school on them. Others carried the tired weight of years on the line, but all of them stood there with the same alertness in their eyes. I told them to put away the clipboards and turn off the screens. Tonight wasn't for logging numbers or checking readings. Tonight was for listening. I showed them the way my master had once shown me, not with diagrams or written steps, but with repetition and patience. We worked each adjustment twice. The first time they followed my lead, the second time I followed theirs, making sure they could feel the difference for themselves. I told them that paper records can be lost, instructions can be misread, but memory, once it's written into your hands, stays. A man can be taken off the payroll, but his rhythm, if he's passed it on, can't be erased. One by one, the presses began to return to their proper voices. The harsh, uneven clangs softened into strong, confident strikes. Conveyors that had been hesitating began to move with steady resolve. At first, the changes were subtle, so subtle you might have missed them if you weren't listening for the way the whole floor started breathing in unison again. But the crew felt it. They moved differently, their steps lighter, their gestures more certain. They began speaking to each other in that quiet shorthand that only comes when everyone trusts the work in front of them. By 2 a.m, the defect section was already shrinking. Pallets that had been left to gather dust were being cleared, their contents reworked, retested, and sent back into the flow. It reminded me of the first thaw in spring, how the snow doesn't melt all at once, but slowly loses its hardness, collapsing inward until it's gone. That mountain of flawed steel began to dissolve in the same way, part by part, piece by piece, until it was no longer a wall, just a reminder of what happens when you stop listening. No one talked about the hour. The crew stayed because they wanted to, not because anyone told them to. When someone brought out a dented kettle and made tea on the side burner near the loading bay, we passed it around without ceremony, drinking it strong and bitter while the machines kept working. There was no need for music. The rhythm of the floor was its own song now, each strike and whir blending into something alive. Just before dawn, I looked around and saw the tired but steady faces of the crew. Their gloves were darker now, their clothes smudged with oil, but their eyes were clear. They had not only fixed the machines, they had found themselves again in the process. The factory was breathing, and so were they. When we finally shut everything down, the silence that followed wasn't the empty, suffocating kind I had known after I left. This silence was full of work well done, of pride, of the knowledge that we had taken something broken and made it whole again. And in that quiet I could almost hear my old master's voice, saying the same words he'd told me decades ago. Don't write it down. Remember it. The morning after our long night, the air on the floor felt different, lighter, cleaner, charged with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes when you know the work in front of you can stand on its own. The presses moved with a steady authority, each strike echoing through the space like a promise kept. Pallets of perfect parts were lined up in neat rows, their edges sharp, their surfaces smooth, every one of them exactly as it should be. The crew moved between them without the restless energy of damage control. They walked with the calm precision of people who knew they had done something right. No one was expecting the client. The sound of his shoes on the concrete floor cut through the morning like a sudden change in the weather. There was no announcement, no warning email. He simply appeared at the far end of the line, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the space the way a man does when he's looking for the truth and not the presentation. The room seemed to draw in a collective breath, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen. He didn't speak at first. He stopped in front of one of the finished pallets, leaned down, and picked up a single part. He turned it in his hand, running his thumb along the edge, his fingers tracing the exactness of the cut, the weight balanced just as it should be. There was a long pause, and in that pause, you could feel everyone listening for his verdict. When it came, it wasn't in the form of a speech or a checklist. It was just the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth, the kind that comes from recognition. "This," he said quietly, almost to himself, "is you again." The words didn't need explanation. Everyone in earshot understood. I saw the color drain from the manager's face. He was standing just behind the client, his carefully rehearsed reassurances suddenly useless. Numbers could be spun, graphs could be bent, but the part in the client's hand told a story that couldn't be argued with. It was the same story the factory used to tell every day before the rhythm was lost. And now it was telling it again. The client placed the part back on the pallet and gave a short nod. "We'll continue," he said. That was all. No praise, no ceremony, just the decision that mattered. And with those two words, the factory's name returned to the supplier list that had almost forgotten it. As he walked away, the crew went back to work, but something had shifted. Their movements carried a new steadiness, as if each of them had been reminded of the value in their hands. There was no applause, no cheers, just the machines speaking clearly again, and the people beside them standing a little straighter. I stood at the edge of the floor, watching the client's back as he left. His words hadn't been meant for me alone, but I felt them settle somewhere deep. Not because they erased what had happened, but because they proved what I had known all along, that the true measure of this place wasn't in the speeches made about it, but in the work it produced when someone cared enough to listen. They called me into the office after the inspection, the air heavy with that forced cordiality people wear when they've already decided to backtrack, but don't want to admit it out loud. The manager gestured toward a chair, his voice careful, his words arranged like the slides he was so fond of showing. He spoke about acknowledging my contribution, about formalizing a role, so that my experience could be utilized in a structured capacity. And then, as if it were a gift wrapped in velvet, he laid it out, consultant, part-time. I let the offer sit between us for a moment, silent and solid, the way a piece of cold steel rests on a workbench before you decide what to do with it. Through the office window, I could see the ramp outside. The crew was loading a truck, their movements easy, their laughter carrying faintly over the rumble of an idling engine. They had grease on their sleeves, sun in their eyes, and a sense of pride in the air around them that no contract could manufacture. That was the real work, not the title on a plaque, not the neat columns in a payroll file, but the passing of skill from one set of hands to another until it became something that lived in the very bones of the place. "I don't need a position," I said finally, my gaze still on the ramp. "What I need is a school." The words seemed to hang there, heavier than the offer he had just made. I explained, not hurriedly, not trying to sell the idea, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has already measured twice and cut once. A training workshop built into the factory itself, a place where young mechanics could learn the language of the machines, not just the commands on a screen, where they could feel the subtle shift in a press's rhythm, understand the warmth in a bearing that meant trouble, hear the way steel talks when it's being treated right. And on the walls, I said, there should be names, not of executives or managers, but of the masters who had kept the factory breathing through decades of winters and strikes, through shortages and surpluses. The people who had passed on more than just techniques. They'd passed on the pride in doing the job right, even when no one was watching. Names like my old masters, like the men and women I'd worked beside who would never see their worth, reflected in a spreadsheet. The manager didn't answer right away. I could see him calculating, not the cost in money, but in the quiet shift of authority such a thing would bring. A school like that would outlast managers, outlast policies. It would plant something in the walls that couldn't be erased when the next transition came. I didn't push. Justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. I'd learned that the hard way. Sometimes it's enough to plant the idea, to let it take root in the silence that follows. I stood, thanked him for the meeting, and left without taking the offer in my hands. Outside, the sunlight hit the steel siding of the factory, warm and bright. I watched the crew at the ramp for a moment longer before walking away, knowing that whether they realized it or not, the school had already started. Out there on the floor, in the way they moved together now, in the rhythm we had restored. On the morning the training workshop opened, I didn't approach the building from the front. The guardhouse, the turnstile, the beep of the badge reader, all of that belonged to another chapter of my life, one that had ended the day they told me I was no longer part of their future. Instead, I came in through the wide bay doors at the back, stepping into the open hall where the smell of fresh-cut metal and machine oil still hung in the air. The space was different now. The far wall had been cleared, painted bright, with workbenches lined neatly beneath the light streaming in from the high windows. New tools sat ready, gleaming but untested. Above them, a long strip of wall carried a row of small brass plaques, each engraved with the name of someone who had built this place in ways no blueprint ever recorded, names that wouldn't be in company brochures, names that didn't fit into PowerPoint slides. My old master's name was there. So was the name of a woman who'd kept Line 2 alive during the winter of '98 when half the crew was out sick. So were the names of men who'd retired quietly, never imagining they'd be remembered in metal. The crew had gathered in the open space, the veterans standing with their arms folded loosely, the younger workers shifting from foot to foot, trying to look casual while their eyes kept going back to the plaques. They weren't dressed for ceremony, they were dressed for work. That made it better. I didn't see who started clapping first. Maybe it was one of the welders. Maybe it was one of the young apprentices who had been at the gate with me all those mornings. But the sound moved through the room like a current, not loud at first, then building until it filled the hall. No one had been told to do it. No one was watching for a signal. It was simply there, rising up from the floor like heat. They weren't applauding a title or a position restored. They were applauding something that had stayed, a presence, a rhythm, a refusal to let the heartbeat of this place fade into silence. I walked forward slowly, letting the sound wash over me, meeting the eyes of the people I passed. Some smiled, some just nodded once, like they were saying, "We remember." I reached the front of the room, near the benches, and turned to see them all standing there, not in rows, not arranged for a photograph, but gathered as they would be around a machine that needed all hands. Behind me, fixed to the wall in letters that caught the morning light, was the plaque I hadn't been told about. The brass was simple, the engraving plain. The rhythm of the shop is its people. No logo, no signatures, just the truth, finally written where it couldn't be erased. I felt something loosen in my chest, the kind of release that doesn't come from winning or proving a point, but from knowing the work will go on without you, and yet always carry a piece of you with it. I smiled, not for the applause, but for what it meant, that the rhythm had been passed on, that even if the power went out tomorrow, these hands, their hands, would still find the way to the start button by memory alone. When the clapping faded, there was no speech. We didn't need one. Someone picked up a wrench, someone else rolled a stool toward a bench, and just like that, the workshop began its life. Not with ceremony, but with the sound of tools meeting metal, steady and sure. And I knew in that moment that I hadn't come back to the factory. I'd never really left.